In this episode, we're diving into the latest research on workplace civility through engaging discussions and real-world examples, diving into the underlying neural pinnings of what it means to be incivil and how to create civility, exploring both the benefits for individuals and organizations. Now, as I quickly share some housekeeping notes, please feel free to share where you're coming in from today. I'm just outside of New York City. We are recording today's sessions, so if you're interested in a replay, be on the lookout for an email later today. This email will also include a survey for feedback and a number of resources that are aligned with today's conversations. We suggest that you put your phone on Do Not Disturb and quit your email and messaging app so you can get the most out of the show today. And it helps with the quality of the audio and the video. We love interaction, as you know. Please keep dropping your thoughts and comments in the chat, and we'll get to as many as we can. So time to introduce our whole set of speakers today that will be joining me. Our first speaker broke barriers as one of the first and for a long time only Black C-level speechwriters in the Fortune 100. Her 3 TED presentations challenging businesses to get serious about inclusion have collectively over 2.5 million views. Her superpowers, applying neuroscience to solve DE&I challenges, build actionable DE&I frameworks and strategies, brokering honest DE&I conversations among top leaders. Please join me in welcoming NLI's Global Head of DE&I, Janet Stovall. It's great to have you today.
Thanks, Emma. Great, good to be here.
Yeah. Our next guest coined the term neuroleadership when he co-founded NLI over 2 decades ago. With a professional doctorate, 4 successful books under his name, and a multitude of bylines ranging from the Harvard Business Review to the New York Times and many more, a warm welcome to our co-founder and CEO of the Neuroleadership Institute, Dr. David Rock. Thanks for being here, David.
Thanks very much, Emma. Great to be back with you and everyone. Janet, great to see you, Janet.
Yeah, this is going to be a great conversation. So as you know, we're talking about incivility and civility, and it's actually a 2-part series this time. We're going to kind of just start the discussion today, talk about what we can do right now, really diving into this challenge that we can't ignore. And we're all feeling it getting worse, and we'd love to hear your thoughts in the chat about how this is feeling for you as we talk to, the behaviors and like what you're seeing, and really why it's important to slow the cycle down. And we'll talk about what we mean by cycle. So I'm just going to start this off and tee it off to Janet. What's going on with incivility in the workplace?
Well, I think it's pretty clear to most of us that it is definitely rising. And that's across all industries, across all types of organizations, and all parts of all types of organizations. In fact, a survey from the American Bar Association said that 85% of people surveyed say that incivility in the workplace is worse than it was 10 years ago. And that was a while back when they did that. So 78% said they witness incivility at least once a month. 76% say they experience it themselves at least once a month. They see it, they experience it. But it's not just people that are affected by incivility. The bottom line, how organizations deliver, their profits, everything, that's feeling the effects of it too. Think about the delays, the distractions, just the general disruption that's caused by incivility. Well, that was estimated to be about $14,000 per employee each year. And that estimate was 15 years ago. We can only imagine what it is now. And we can also only imagine what the impact is on teamwork, innovation, customer relationships. It's hard to even calculate what that is.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I would love to hear people's reaction on what and like how they feel like it's changing over time. We can all predict why and like how it will be changing over the next few months, what they predict as an outcome of this. But absolutely think about your own individual experience, whether or not it was an outward presentation of rude behavior. Is it rudeness, or is it just you just feel something is off, and how much that delays your own productivity? David, I would love to hear what your thoughts are and how you see this changing now.
Yeah, this concept kind of really came onto my radar during the first Trump presidency, the first 4 years. And when it happened, a lot of people were really, really shocked and upset and but in particular in the workplace, we had the situation of very, very passionate Black Lives Matters like groups, and kind of literally up against red hat groups, like people in factories, like literally lining up. You sort of picture it, and screaming at each other. And suddenly this, like, it wasn't just incivility, it was like incredible like verging on violence. And at the time there was like de-escalation skills needed to happen, and we ended up getting into that. But it just got it sort of really got my attention at the time of how much kind of incivility, verging on aggression at times there is in the workplace. And that's continued, sort of punctuated or accelerated by various world events. That kind of incivility has happened. I think post-pandemic, people are very, very raw still from the experience. A lot of people just like lost their social skills, lost the ability to just be nice to other humans in public. And so I think there's been sort of been a trend, growing trend, I guess, since that time, or maybe I've just noticed it. Interesting, we wrote a piece at that time about what you can do as a leader about incivility and in this kind of division, and you can't ignore it. That's tacit approval. You can't necessarily come out for one side or the other. You've got to kind of validate each side to some degree, like not invalidate a side, right? Validate to some degree, or just so that they feel heard, and then focus on shared goals, like bring people back to the mission of the business, bring people back to shared goals. That's what there seems to, so that's at an organizational level. What we're going to talk about today is like, what can individuals do? Not so much the organizational managers, but I think at an organizational level, it's a lot about bringing people back to shared goals, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And, and I think what's coming up in the chat is really like, how do we even talk about or define incivility? Because what is interesting about the definition and how academia, let's say, has defined incivility is it's not always so easy to see. And maybe it's not even so, it's maybe not necessarily intentional, but it happens. And so I'd love, Janet, how would you discuss or define incivility?
Well, we all think that we will know it when we see it. But the reality is, we think it's somebody's rude, somebody's disrespectful. And usually it's not clear often it's not clear whether the person actually intended to cause any harm. So it can be subtle, it can be obvious, it can be intentional, it can be not. And you know how it looks. It's like you interrupt somebody, you roll the eyes, you ignore the emails, you just actually put somebody down. But whatever the form, it creates a negative and an uncomfortable atmosphere where people feel unsafe or undervalued. That's sort of the standard. But it's not, but like you said before, it's not always easy to see. It can be kind of tricky. Sometimes it's obvious. Somebody yells at you. But usually it's subtle, like a rude tone, or you cut somebody off. And what's rude to me might be totally normal to somebody else. Sometimes there can be a cultural difference of the way you just communicate. And honestly, power dynamics can make it even harder to see. Like maybe your boss thinks they're saying something because they're being funny, but it comes across as totally different to the people who are not the boss. It can be mean to the team. They can feel it differently. Think about going online. David, you were talking about how things have changed. One of the things that also has changed is that we do so much in the pandemic. It was starting before that, but definitely in the pandemic, when we went online, you don't have body language to help you out. So and people can hide behind a computer screen. So the subtle stuff is there, but it's actually worse sometimes in many ways because it's insidious. It flies under the radar. You can't call it out. People might not even realize they're being rude, or they can dismiss it as a big deal, as no big deal.
Yeah, it's actually interesting you brought that up. There's sort of two mechanisms there that are happening. One is that if you sort of imagine a continuum, you've got in person, then you've got on the phone, then you've got in sort of real-time chat, then you've got an email, right? People are basically more rude as you go down that ladder, right? People aren't so rude in person, they're less rude on the telephone, but they're much more rude in text, and really rude in email quite often. And part of it is sort of people being uncivil. But the other half of that is the receiver finds the information really painful, more painful as well. And with the absence of social cues, you tend to assume the worst. So that's
Right.
happening.
Right.
But separately to that, you're also just, it might actually be uncivil, and you just feel it more in that more digital environment. So I think people are ruder, and it hurts more in a more digital environment as well.
And I don't know about you, but I think that I think people are more sensitive to, we're looking for it now. I think we are so polarized and so we feel it so much more in the workplace that even now you always want to assume good intent, but it's hard because I think even when people don't mean anything, we are sensitized to expect it. There's just kind of a bad vibe, and arguments start, and it can damage relationships, and it really can have a lot of damage on an environment. And people, sometimes they do mean it, but I think most of the time they don't. But the effects are the same.
Yeah, absolutely. And Ali said it really well in the chat. Incivility is like a delayed bomb because it can take such a long time of rumination and thinking about it. And you, as an individual, you're trying to understand why that happened. And as David said, you're thinking the worst. If you don't have any other information, you're thinking about it as the worst. And so without any clarity, and the sender might have just been sending a text without the right emoji. So without that right emoji, you're going to assume that this was sent out of bad intent, or they were frustrated or angry. And that leads to you thinking about this for a week. And it delays work. And then maybe how you respond the next time will be with a bit more incivil behavior, a bit more kind of like rushed or blunt response. And then it can spiral, as we'll talk about. It can really just get out of control. And that can all stem from a lack of understanding, but it's still under the umbrella of incivility. Yeah. So David, what do you see is going on in the brain then? We kind of mentioned a bit about this lack of value, things like that. What would you say is going on?
Yeah, I mean, we talk a lot about the threat response that we all experience. The threat or reward response, something we experience moment to moment. And when we experience incivility, obviously it's a pretty strong threat response. It's largely a status threat. It's a put down, right? So we're walking past the kitchen and someone makes a comment that you can't really tell if it's rude or not, but it's just not nice, and you're definitely getting this status threat, and you feel your sort of heat rising, your heart rate going up, and you feel like you got to protect your status to some degree because status is a really, really important thing, in not just in the workplace but in life. And so it also can be a relatedness threat, like it's someone you thought was on your team, and now they're being kind of cruel to you in some ways. And I think one of the issues is these things are often ambiguous, and ambiguity is the worst. Like you can't tell if the person was being mean or funny. Maybe they intended to be funny, but there's sort of a mean edge because they're still annoyed about something you did. And we'll get into this in a minute. There's this sort of area of your sort of sarcasm, irony, whatever. And I'm guilty of this terribly. My kids are always pulling me up on this. They say, Dad, you got to stop using dark humor. But there's not much place for dark humor in the workplace when it doesn't land well. And I think sometimes people are just pushing it far, and but the humor is on top of some sort of relational dysregulation that's going on between people. So it just doesn't land well. You don't really know, and so now you've got uncertainty as well. You've got a status attack. You've got you're feeling out group. You're feeling like a relatedness attack. You're feeling out group. Might be really uncertain as well. You don't have any control. You don't have a sense of autonomy or control at all, and it can feel really unfair, right? So you can easily get all 5 domains of SCARF kind of fired off, but the big one is status. But then the other ones can really kick in as well. So that's what's going on. And certainly if you're getting 5, you're getting potentially an overwhelming threat response.
Yeah. And I would say we mentioned this a bit as well too, Janet, is just this idea that we're in a more sensitive spot right now. And we talk a bit about just like long-term trauma coming out of several years of all of this uncertainty and ambiguity and divisiveness. And that doesn't just take a week to heal. This takes months, if not years, to heal. So we're at a spot where now the tiniest little thing, just like one little interruption, can cause us to immediately assume that we're being insulted. And maybe we were, and maybe it was just a mistake.
You know, people talk about, we've all heard the term microaggression, and even the people who coined that term are starting to say, you know, they're really not micro because they really do build up over time. So there's nothing micro about this. It's the same thing about incivility. It may seem small, but it spirals. And you talked about that a little bit, and it spirals. And so it doesn't, it's a small thing, but it can have really big, big implications over time.
Yeah. And you know, something that was dropped in the chat is this, Paul dropped this in the chat. He thinks it's key to assume positive intent. Now, what would you suggest about that? I mean, is that the best way? Maybe.
It is the best way, but it's not always easy because if you think about that, positive intent depends on who you are. Because, you know, David, you were talking a little bit about sometimes, you know, people will make a joke. Sometimes you don't understand the cultural context that somebody's coming from. And so it might be possible for them to assume positive intent. You can try. And I think it is good that we all do try. And I think it's always better if we assume that people did not mean harm. But sometimes that's easier with some people than it's others. Sometimes it's easier in other situations than it is others. It's just hard to expect that you're always going to be the one who can kind of, you know, turn the other cheek and assume the best of people. And it's understandable if you can't. It doesn't mean you're a bad person. It just means that it depends on who it is, what was said, what the context was. So it's better if we all try to work a little bit on both sides of that equation and don't always assume that people will assume that it's positive intent on your part.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah. And I think the lack of general, you know, we're much more global now, right? We're working with individuals that have much different experiences. So even just the experience at a prior company,
Exactly.
or cultural difference, going into a situation and making a certain kind of joke that works isn't always going to land so well. And it's hard to even keep track of all of these things. How can we even also be ourselves in a work environment if we can't bring our own jokes in? Yeah. David, any thoughts on that? Just the like, and the downstream effects of all that threat on our ability to work and collaborate.
Yeah, look, one of the hardest things to get your head around as an adult, really, not to mention a leader, is intent versus impact. And I think I can like actually remember the struggle, the sort of philosophical struggle I had with myself, sometimes in my 20s, of like, just because you intended, you know, it one way, you actually have to be responsible and thoughtful about the impact separate to the intent, you know. And it was really hard at the time. I was like, no, I got to be authentic to myself, where their response is their responsibility. That's nothing to do with me, you know. And I was sort of really arrogant in my youth about that. And then at some point I was like, wow, okay, well, actually, I need to actually think about impact. And in some ways, intent doesn't really matter. Particularly if you're trying to get things done in the world through other people. Like, what matters is your actual impact, right? So I think a lot of people struggle with that. And, you know, many times I've intended one thing and accidentally impacted people a completely different way. And Janet often has to call me up and say, David, we have to have one of those conversations again where you accidentally scarfed a bunch of people. And I listen, and we you know, it's always, every single time, been completely blindsided. I've been completely blindsided. Like, I didn't intend to upset anyone. The impact was really different to my intent, you know. And sometimes my intent was really clear to me, like I was addressing this issue, but the impact was completely different. It wasn't always just bad dad jokes or bad, you know, humor. It was so there's, I just think that intent versus impact issue is a really important thing. And then for leaders for everyone to clear up, clean things up when you've accidentally impacted people a way you didn't want to.
And I think that's what you said. That's very important. And that's what I came off you to make that point. Yes, the important thing is, and you do this, is when we have one of those little talks. So when you realize it, you come back and you say, okay, look, that's not what I meant. And that's important because I think we do, back to what you're saying, Emma, about assuming positive intent. There's something about giving people grace because 9 times out of 10, you've probably done something that was unintentional as well. And the key is understanding that sometimes intention and impact don't connect. And when that happens, acknowledging that and saying, even if you explain what your intent is, not necessarily justifying it, just saying, I am sorry, and I didn't know that, and then listening and
Yeah.
understanding. The important thing is to understand why it was wrong, so that then, the next time, maybe you don't do that. We'll do something different the next time, but that is key in leadership, I think. So, yeah.
Yeah, I think it's sort of mixing two things up. I'm confusing people. I think the like as an individual communicator, being thoughtful about impact or not just intent, I think is really important, right? But as a receiver of messages, I think it is really important to consider people's intent.
Mhm.
Because a lot of the source of conflict is misreading people's intent. Like I see it, right? It'll be like, oh, this person was really trying to get me. No, they were actually just trying to deliver to the client, on time. This person was, being really mean to me. No, they were dealing with their own trauma from this past event. So much like we misread people's intent a lot. And I think if you assume positive intent as a receiver of messages, these things can be helped. So I do think there's a role for assuming positive intent in there, but really think about impact as a deliverer of messages. I think it's important.
Mhm. Agreed.
Yeah, no, it's so interesting. And throughout this whole discussion, all I'm thinking is this is really difficult. This is difficult to get right. Thinking about your own intent and then receiving it well, understanding completely. And then on top of that, all we keep talking about in so many of our episodes is just how overwhelmed and at capacity we all are. So how can we do that how can we pause and make sure that our intent is clear, and that we're also trying to understand if we said things in the wrong tone or in the wrong way and then go back in to apologize. I think a lot of times we might miss going back in and making sure we were clear and stopping that cycle of the rumination that might have been in the receiver's head at that time. Pause them and explain before it getting too out of control. So I think, and especially as leaders, we know we talk about this, and David, you brought this up, this idea of power, that our perspective is going to be different because we're seeing this more strategic vision level perspective. We might not have someone that can talk to us and pull us aside and say, that was not the right way to say that, and you might have they have misinterpreted you in some way. So it might also be important as a leader to always have that person to keep you accountable in that way as well. Yeah. And the other thing that's coming up, and as we kind of move over onto this long-term impact on business is we talk about this often, this contagion effect as well. So you might be directly targeting or it might be misinterpreted by one individual, but what we observe in the workplace, we observe these behaviors. It has the exact same impact on our brain as it does as if we experienced it ourselves. So this contagion effect, we show this, the research shows this, that experiencing or watching bad behavior has the same effect and has impact on our collaboration, our ability to, communicate, to understand all those cognitive effects, the same thing. So you can imagine what, some poor interactions that impact can have on the whole organization, like the culture itself. And so this can very easily kind of grow out of control. Yeah. Any thoughts, David?
Yeah, I mean, we just put a link in about the contagion effect. I mean, we learn culture by watching people, and we learn it unconsciously. Like, we learn it by just unconsciously observing behaviors and interactions, what's okay, what's not okay. And, it's particularly a new person in a company or a team just really learns how things are done. And I think the so much of culture and climate is just very, very automatic. It's watching people interacting. And so you got to really watch this. I think there's people do something because they feel that everyone does this here. That's why we do things, right? People do things because this feels like how this feels okay here. So making things normative, like being uncivil, one uncivil act, a bunch of other people can see it, and it can definitely have that ripple effect across, it can have that ripple effect across the business.
I think about my first job out of college was working for Morgan Stanley. And back in the days when, you had big quotrons and people doing stuff, people yelled at each other on the trading floor on a regular basis. And coming in there, it was just shocking me how people so rude. I was moving to New York for the first time. It was a cultural change. It was an organizational change. But that was the language. That's the way people talked. It seemed incredibly uncivil to me, but that's just the way it was. And so I think, to David's point, sometimes what you see is in civil workplace is the nature of that place, but you can't necessarily take that and take it somewhere else that has a different kind of environment. And when you're that person who's in civil in a different kind of environment, it does affect how the teams work. It affects things from all levels. It can affect how customers feel, how everything works. And it does have an effect on the bottom line. And it makes it so that people don't do the jobs you want them there to do.
Right. Absolutely. And Steve dropped in the chat that you're so real, and that is 100% true. So being real, why don't you talk a bit about this incivility spiral? We've been kind of mentioning it. Why is it so important for us to really stop this at its head right now?
Well, I think the researchers named Anderson and Pearson did some research on this. And what they call it is they actually call something the incivility spiral. And it works like this. Somebody's a little rude, then somebody else is rude back, and it just escalates and escalates and escalates. And before you know it, you've got a toxic workplace and everybody's miserable. Negativity just becomes sort of the norm. People stop trusting each other. They don't care about their work, and they're more likely to be rude themselves. It can even spiral into something that turns into like official office complaints, lawsuits. It can seriously damage the organization's reputation. So it spirals. And if you don't stop it, I think, Emma, I think you said something about that. You got to stop it at some point. And there are a lot of ways to do that. But if you don't, it can have some very serious effects.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's clearly an issue. I feel like we've set the stage for something that we really need to fix right away. And maybe address at multiple levels. So before we kind of dive into like the brain-based ways to fix this and the behaviors that we can kind of start doing now, just curious about this concept of civility and respect, because as we were doing all of our research, in all of the definitions around civility and civil workplaces, sometimes we'd see the word respect come in as well. And so I'd love to just get a little idea about how you would pull these apart, because you believe there really are different concepts and creating them is different.
One of the reasons I think that a lot of people have, especially people who do DEI work, who have pushed back against the concept of studying civility, is because that term is often used interchangeably with respect. They are not the same things. And we make that distinction. It's kind of like civility is being polite. It's not being, I won't use the word, but it's not being that person, okay? Respect, though, is about truly valuing people and their contributions. So we're going to talk about that a little bit more next week when we're going to take those things apart. The way I think about it is that civility in its true term is about human courtesy. But when you take it to human respect, often then you're moving into the DEI space, because you have to be aware of and value something about another person. You can't respect somebody that you don't value. And so that's what we're going to talk about a little bit more next week. We're going to break those things apart.
Yeah. Amazing. Yeah, but let's start with civility then, right? We went through all of the research, understanding like what is civility, the set of shared behaviors. And as soon as we see that, we think, oh, we can create those. We can create a set of behaviors. And we started kind of trying to unpack that. What is the base level of courtesy in the workplace that can allow us to get things done, David?
Yeah, no, we're looking at like how do you make people more civil? And the obvious answer people will go to firstly is put in like a cost of being incivil, like tell everyone they get fired or they get fined, or it doesn't really work. Like the threat response around incivility isn't really going to work. And then you sort of go to the other extreme and you can say, well, can we make humans kinder? Um, is it possible to make people kinder intrinsically? I'm not so sure. And I don't think that's what we're trying to do. But it's like, all right, well, can you break a cycle? Can we sort of be in the middle somewhere? Can we break a cycle somehow? And what's the habit that happens in that moment of incivility? And what's a new habit we could replace it with? And we were thinking about that and looking at it from a cognitive perspective. And I think what happens with incivility is there's a moment where you sort of you have this opportunity to be uncivil. You walk into a lunchroom and people are eating and they're looking really relaxed, and you have this moment of choice, right? You can say, hey, I hope you're enjoying, like something really incivil or uncivil. It can be either, right? Incivil, uncivil. So you got this sort of moment. And what we realized is that a little bit like the speaking up work, the first step is kind of noticing that moment, notice the like urge, and you notice that you're about to say something, and in particular, notice what that automatic response is. Like, notice your urge, right? You've got this urge to be, cruel or slightly mean, or slightly nasty, but in a sort of couched way. You've got this. So notice the urge. And I think that first step is like noticing those things coming up, noticing yourself wanting to be, a little something. And then the second thing is like, maybe label that a little bit, like what's driving that, what's going on, so that you can reduce it. Oh, this person, was mean to me in a meeting last week, so I'm just trying to get back at them. Oh, I'm just, I don't like this person's boss and I'm trying to, cause conflict. Or like you sort of label like what's going on. And then the third step is what we were thinking of as like communicating cleanly. And I want to dig into that a bit. But yeah, the first step is like pay attention to how you're communicating, and notice these sort of urges to be a little bit rude, basically. Notice the desire to poke at someone. See if you can identify what's driving that, and then how do you be really kind of clean in your communication? Now, let's give an example of what I mean by clean. You're sort of annoyed that people appear to be having a long lunch, right? So unclean, like uncivil, would be like, why are you guys loafing off? It's not very civil, right? Or, you guys are wasting time. Don't you know there's money to be made? Or there's many versions of uncivil. Some of them are quite rude. Some of them are just like on the edge. Like, you say, you guys have enough time for lunch? Do you need more time for lunch, right? You can be a little humorous, right? But people read that pretty badly, especially if you're more senior. And so, how do you interact in a way that's clean? And the question with clean is that the recipient isn't going to be left with some sort of ambiguity or uncertainty, and there's no like negative punch in it. There's no like negative punch. Now, that doesn't mean you have to like step over things. There's ways to do it. What lunch hour are you guys on? Are you on 12 to 1? You're on 1 to 2. What's your, what are you guys on? Right? And if you do it in a friendly way, you're still addressing, you're not stepping over something, but you're addressing, your concern that people are having an extra long lunch, but you're doing it in a way that doesn't leave a scar for the other people. So we've been developing these kind of, we're having fun with it, like these different scenarios, and you can be very uncivil, slightly uncivil, sort of neutral, slightly positive, more positive, in your tone. I think as people sort of see these continuums, it's like, oh yeah, I'm sort of here a lot. And you don't have to be nice, you just have to be neutral, right? You just have to learn, like, let's just be neutral. And that's kind of what civil is. Civil is the absence of uncivil in a way. And so you're just trying to at least be neutral. So we're not trying to make people kinder. We're not trying to say, let's all be nice to each other, kumbaya, and pass the oranges. And, we're not necessarily trying to do that. We're trying to say, notice these moments where you're going to create unnecessary conflict, and just do it cleanly instead. right? Communicate whatever you want to communicate cleanly, without the sort of, because then you don't have the follow-on effect. So that's how we're seeing it. Each of those steps have some really interesting research in them, and some really interesting science in them. So we're in the, we're unpacking that at the moment, thinking about it, and we're starting to build solutions around this for partners as well.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think when thinking about those first two habits, notice your response and inhibit the response, this all seems to be hinging on this emotional regulation. And we talk a lot about emotional regulation, and the power it has on just how you understand the environment around you and your ability to actually think clearly. So we know for anyone who's read any of our work or listened to any of these podcasts, is just that when you're able to kind of notice what is impacting you and understand it, whether you're labeling it with, oh, that was, a status threat, or reappraise it, this is, they must be in a rush, or whatever it is that you appraise it with. You don't have to necessarily be right, but it's your ability to kind of like dampen that limbic response and kind of generally re-engage your prefrontal cortex, allowing you to keep focusing. But what's coming up for me is just that, who is going through these behaviors is maybe you need to do this in response to how you're interpreting somebody else. So we're just really asking everyone to stop the cycle at some point. You might not be the instigator of this. And I'd love to kind of hear your thoughts on that, Janet.
Well, it's interesting when you say this. We're all moving in a space now, sort of a heightened sense of threat, stress, all these things, and they make us reach out in the world differently. One of the things I always say, and I talk to my kids about this, if you're having a certain response a lot and it's happening to you a lot, the problem is probably you. It's probably not everybody else is just, not understanding you or whatever. The problem is probably you, because it is hard, sometimes in the moment to say, to stop yourself and say, why am I doing this? Because you're just kind of saying it. But I think that one way, I know for me, that's been the thing. If I see that there's a pattern of response, I don't always assume that everybody else has the issue. I start asking, is it me? And if you can start asking yourself that over time, I do think you get better in the moment of catching yourself before you do it. But you have to be aware of how people respond, because really sometimes that's the only way you can know that you've done something that's incivil, is by reading other people's responses to it.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And it might be, thinking about this, if you're the only one going through these interactions and noticing and pausing and reappraising and then trying to communicate cleanly, then you'll be the only one in the organization trying to be civil. So it does have to spread throughout the organization. So if everyone were to kind of practice these behaviors, maybe not everyone would love each other and be best friends. We're not asking everyone to go out and have lunch together, but in the workplace, being able to be productive and be able to get work done and be engaged, these are maybe the baseline level of behaviors.
Yeah, civil behaviors are superficial. I mean, and I don't say that in a bad way, but it's like you said, it's the baseline table stakes behavior. And people have to get along, people have to work together. And as someone from the South can tell you, this is sort of that difference between civil behavior and respect. As somebody from the South who is very well versed in the bless your heart to somebody, we can say that in a heartbeat. We can be as nice to you as all get out and have zero respect for you. So there are two things that have to change to create a truly civil environment: behavior and belief. Human courtesy is about behavior, human respect is about belief. One can be an HR issue, the other can be a DEI challenge. And so that's why we separate them when we talk about them.
Yeah, we're going to dig into respect next week. I was just thinking about Bryce's comment in the chat, and we've been sort of thinking about the where these different skills and habits live. Like, if you think of civility as very foundational, it's like, don't be mean. Civility is like, don't be mean. From there you go, to respect, which is a bit deeper, right? Being on the positive side. So it's not just the absence of negative and being neutral. Civility is sort of being neutral. Respect is adding positive, right? But then you go from there to inclusion, I think, where you're not just respecting people, but you're really including them. And so you've got now the inclusion habits, but you're going from there to psychological safety. How do you actually create the conditions for people to really argue and debate healthy ways and really kind of tackle the ideas? And so I think there's a continuum from civility to respect to inclusion to psychological safety that that people that know. What's interesting is you end up kind of coming back to the same central ideas around, in-group and out-group and status and fairness and these kinds of things. Yeah, you end up coming back to the same kind of biological understandings of what's going on as you learn these different skills. But it does seem to be in a bit of a pathway, I think, starting with civility. And it's a little depressing in a way that we've got to go out and teach companies about, or individuals about, don't be mean. But that's the way the world is at the moment. Might be a whole lot of causes, but it's like, that's kind of a priority in companies at the moment, is let's turn down the meanness. It's, particularly in retail, hospitality, some of these places, there needs to be a little bit of this work done.
Yeah, I was thinking the same thing. I think it's amazing that we have to continue to work on this, that we're diving back in and trying to understand how to be civil with each other. But you're right, it is the first step, and then we can do these other pieces that are just as difficult. But this is not easy. It's definitely not easy to respond civilly when you feel like you've been undermined in some way, and that you see these behaviors around. You see your own team, you're in group, responding in a certain way. We react differently to individuals that we feel like are in our out group. We talk about this all the time. When we feel like our status is threatened, then we're going to react in certain ways. So this is not an easy set of behaviors. While we say this is a foundational step, it's definitely not easy.
No, and let's face it, the bar has been lowered, in terms of political discourse. We talked about the pandemic and the distance. We talked about what, being online has done. The bar has been lowered. So it does feel like, why do we have to, at this point, have this discussion? We've always had to have it, but it does seem more prevalent now because it is the ability to be in civil has been we've been given much more permission than we ever had before. And those effects are real.
Yeah. Yeah. What are your thoughts, David?
Yeah, I'm just curious to see what questions folks have in the audience or what's resonating. This is the first time we've talked about these habits. So I'm curious about questions from the audience or any feedback on the habits that we're outlining. Some interesting reflections in the chat. But yeah, just curious what folks think. We're not trying to make people kinder. We're just trying to turn down the meanness in a way, the accidental meanness and the intentional meanness. Trying to turn that down and doing that with, increasing awareness of that moment, learning to regulate and then learning to communicate just cleanly and showing people the difference between clean and not clean. Sort of really having that distinction. I think so that's what we think is the pathway to better habits. But yeah, what do folks think? What are you seeing in the chat there, Emma?
Yeah, I'm seeing a lot, but what's interesting is Paul dropped again in the chat something around, you can respond civilly to someone who attacks you, maybe to disarm them. If they're spoiling for a fight, for instance, how do you not take the bait? And what's coming up for me in that, and that makes total sense, is also what's the role of the leader in this? If you have individuals behaving in a certain way, how you can't expect your employees to always not take the bait unless you're changing the culture. So what is the role of the leader in this?
Yeah, I mean the leaders set the tone. Obviously, it's a cliche, but the leaders, a leader who screams at their team, every few weeks, makes it completely okay for everyone else to do that. So leaders really set the tone for really everything. And there's a lot of research on this. We pay attention to the highest status person in a community. We take on their emotions, but we also take on their habits, we take on their beliefs. We do all of that unconsciously without trying. So the leaders really set the tone. By leader, I mean just team leader, supervisor, at any level, they'll really set the tone. So I think Role modeling this obviously is important. Role modeling, real civility. And, I think the moments that matter are cleaning up when you've made a mistake as well. So it's not about being perfect, but I think, leaders need to clean up when they've accidentally been uncivil and recognize it and acknowledge it and apologize. And I think those moments really help to create the right culture as well.
And mind you, we're talking about, we're not talking about flat out bold disruption. That's the zero tolerance thing. I mean, we know leaders know that. That's clear. It's the stuff that's not so obvious that is harder to deal with. And like David's saying, that a lot of that has to do with modeling that behavior. And quite honestly, you don't usually have the very blatant stuff. If that were the case, it would be relatively easy to fix. But it's the more subtle things, it's the ongoing things that are problematic. And if a leader does not model that behavior, you cannot expect anybody that you're leading to do it. So what you do matters.
Yeah, absolutely. And, we're getting a lot of questions in here now. One thing that's coming up is just, what do we mean by being clean? When we communicate cleanly, what is that? What does that look like?
Yeah, I mean, it's literally like if you said this to 100 people, most of them would be neutral in their emotional response. They wouldn't be positive, they wouldn't be negative. They would just be like, they'd hardly notice the comment, right? So for me, the clean language is it's everything that's necessary and nothing that isn't, right? It's just communicating in a way that doesn't create a threat response to the other person. If they're wired up and you're seeing skin conductance, you're not seeing sweat when they hear what you've said. So for me, clean language is just not language that doesn't create a threat response on the other side. But it's not necessarily trying to be kind and lovely and warm either. It's not necessarily trying to be inclusive. It's just being clean. And that's how I would describe it. And of course, someone mentioned this earlier, different cultures have different interpretations of everything. So what might be clean in one culture might be super insulting in another. So we need to be mindful of that. But yeah, for me, it's about what you're saying lands in a way that people hardly notice it and certainly don't have a spiky negative reaction. Janet, how would you describe it?
I'd agree. And I think that it really depends on what you're communicating about. When you were giving your example of the too long a lunch, I kept thinking, all right, so if I'm a leader and I see this, how would I communicate cleanly about that? And there is a reality that sometimes no matter what you say, depending on your position, somebody is going to have a response to it because you're the leader, they're not. Even if you were to come in very simply and say, you know what, glad you're enjoying lunch. However, we really don't, as an organization here, go past an hour and it's looking a little past that. That could be a very objective response and somebody could respond. So, and negatively because a leader said it to them. But the reality is I think it's transparency. To me, it's being very transparent about something. And that some of that calls for knowing why you're having the interaction in the first place. So if you as a leader, for example, came to that extended lunch and you knew that there was a policy against it, if you knew that there were things to be done, David, you mentioned sometimes a leader sees strategy that other people don't, maybe having a transparent discussion of that is a way to speak cleanly. So cleanly depends, I think, on what the situation is, who you're talking to, when you have that conversation and all those kind of things. But it still goes back to you at first asking yourself the question, stopping in the moment and saying, why do I feel the need to say this? And sometimes when you get that straight in your head, it will drive how you say it. And it may make it easier to have that clean and transparent response that you wouldn't have otherwise.
That's the labeling part. Oh, why am I feeling like being mean here?
Mm-hmm.
What's making me feel mean here? Oh, it's the person who cut me off in traffic this morning. Oh, it's the email I just got from my boss. Oh, it's the way I was treated in this. Like, what's making me want to be mean? So I think the things like notice your desire to be uncivil or mean. See if you can label what's going on, and then how do you land it cleanly? I think is the focus. Yeah, no, interesting conversations, some interesting questions. I'm curious about the sort of people's thoughts and reflections on the framework itself as well. But anything coming up there in the chat, Emma?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of the comments are really around like the communication piece, because I think that is one of the most difficult parts, is making sure it's communicated in a way in a global environment, maybe with a new team, depending on your level, whether you're on a team, or you're a team lead, or you're, like an executive level. That's going to come off differently depending on who you're talking to and how you're communicating. And in a virtual environment where communication is so different, and we're sensitive to all of the different pieces, how often are individuals on camera during virtual meetings, and how are they communicating? Is it only chat, or is it so? All of those things. Can you see people side chatting while you're in a meeting? All of those things are just different kinds of ways that can be interpreted differently. And so I think it's difficult. And we did get a question just around, inheriting uncivil teams. So if you're trying to change the culture of your team, that's another challenge. How do you change behaviors on a team? And we do have a lot of experience changing behaviors, but that's another challenge. You're faced with this. This is the culture of their team. And how do you change that? Yeah.
I go back to, I think a lot of it is as a leader about being transparent and having a degree of vulnerability. I mean, I tell people all the time, look, I sometimes say things and they come off wrong. I don't mean to. Call me on it. I'm giving you agency to call me on it. Feel that you can say something to me. Now, if I tell somebody that, I can't then go and pop off on them later or punish them for that. I got to be willing to do that. I do think there's something about admitting when you make a mistake, admitting that you do make mistakes, and giving people space to not be perfect, because it is scary. As we're having this conversation, I'm sure I'm as usual not looking at the chat as well as I should. See, I'll admit that. But I am sure that some of the angst is, well, my goodness, can I say anything? Should I just not talk?
Right.
I would argue that you should. You should talk and you should be open.
Yeah. Yeah. It's some of that fear happened in the pandemic about, I can't talk about DEI at all because people are just too sensitive and stuff. But you got to be okay having clumsy conversations. You got to be okay just wading into these things a little bit. Fantastic. So yeah, I think we're going to wrap up in a sec. We'll put up a poll before folks jump off. Just good to know how to support you. Such a rich and important conversation. Thinking about how do we, create less mean workplaces. It's a low bar, isn't it? But I think it's important. Let's follow the science around these things. Speaking of science, I'm super psyched about our summit coming up, October 29 and 30. And around the clock with times in EMEA and APAC and North America. And I'm working on the sessions with everyone in the last few weeks. It's going to be amazing. To be honest, I build the sessions, so I've got things to learn. I'm excited about all the things I'm going to learn at the summit from all the different presenters and the research we're presenting. There's a lot. So if I'm excited, you should probably be excited. It's looking really amazing, and try and hold the day as much as you can, or the 2 days, 29th and 30th of October. And there's my team can put a link in the chat if you haven't checked that out yet. But a really great program. I'm also excited about an event we're doing in person in New York. We're doing a brain-based design and facilitation workshop. I'm actually leading it. It's a double click into how to really design and deliver from a much more brain-based way than anyone else kind of thinks about. And to be honest, we're giving away a lot of our internal training that we would teach faculty inside partner clients to really understand how to design and deliver in the way that we do. So that's coming up next month in New York City. I understand there'll be a virtual one for people anywhere early 2025 as well. You'll see details about that soon. So those things are happening. And I'm excited about that. Janet, great to have a conversation with you again today. Thanks for your real, authentic presence and reflections. And I know next week we're going to dig into respect. So kind of getting further on the continuum. What is it to really respect people? How does that look? I look forward to that conversation next week. Thanks so much, Emma.
I do too. Thanks, Emma. Thanks, David.
Thank you both. Yeah, it was great. And I know we're absolutely excited about the summit. I know there was a poll that popped up, so please take a look at it. Let us know how we can help you. It'll stay up for a few moments as I just kind of go through the last announcement. So as David mentioned, Summit 2024 is on its way. It'll take place the 29th and 30th. You've seen the links in the chat. We will have one on civility, so and also how it links to psychological safety, as this has kind of been coming up in the discussion. So it'll track with what we talk about there, and we'll have researchers that have studied civility and incivility and the impact on the workplace. So we'll be talking about all of this there. It'll be a virtual experience and global, as David mentioned. And so the summit website is live, information on all of our speakers and the topics, and tickets are available. So just visit the website to see, just to take a look at the whole schedule. If you've enjoyed today's conversation, you'll love the podcast show. So make sure you subscribe. You can hear the past Friday webinars on demand. So look for Your Brain at Work wherever you enjoy listening to podcasts. And this is where we say goodbye. On behalf of today's guest and myself, the NLI team behind the scenes, thank you for joining us, and we'll be here next week. Take care.